Hi, my name is Dale. I'm one of the founders of AI.Reverie. I'm really excited to have Chris Emura from Vulcan, who's the Executive Director of Engineering. Looking forward to the conversation and looking forward to hearing about what he's working on there. So, Chris, welcome.
Hi, Dale. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. So, from your work at Vulcan, from what I've seen, you work on a lot of really interesting humanitarian problems. So, could you just maybe briefly tell the audience a summary of some of the sort of major challenges you're kind of looking to solve there?
Yeah, I think I'll frame it from the top and then maybe move down to more specific things. But at the highest level, the mission Vulcan overall is just to make the world a better place. And I think obviously
Mm.
from the engineering side, we have a tech for good element. And then further down into that, you can break it down into four pillars. And some of these overlap, right? As far as oceans, climate, communities, and conservation. And then from there, you can have physical projects. I think you're aware of some of them, the Skylight for illegal fishing, Earth Ranger for conservation, a lot of climate modeling, Coral Atlas. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can look up on our website. I think from further down from a technology point of view, you can just look at predictive analytics, tons of sensors, sensors here being satellite, terrestrial, maritime, large geographies of some kind. And then the limited good guy resources, right? As far as limited resources to do the right thing and how you can kind of bring in technology, predictive analytics to make the best use of those limited resources and time, right? So that's it in a nutshell as far as what we're trying to solve, at least the class of problems that my groups are responsible for.
That's great. And given that AI Reverie is a company focused a lot on computer vision, could you maybe talk a little bit about where computer vision plays a role in some of these challenges you're trying to solve?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, if you look at just even the ML side of things, computer vision, and then there's the visual side versus NLP or maybe some of the acoustic stuff
Of
is clearly
course.
one of our bigger areas. And so for there, if you look at things like census and the counting problem in general, right, whenever you have to count things or measure
Right.
things, create a dashboard for things, that's a huge part of our technology portfolio. And so you have that along with the usual anti-poaching, maybe some other monitoring things, and so there's no end to that class of
Uh-huh.
use case.
It's funny because one of the things I hear about conservation is that it's so important to count, right? If you can't count things, then the conservation problem becomes so much harder. Would
Yeah,
you say
yeah, for
that
sure.
that's accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, I think in some cases it's just difficult. If you look at number of fish in the sea, so to speak, or number of elephants, number of rhinos, I think it sounds pretty simple. Well, maybe it does to most people, but yeah, it is a difficult challenge. It's certainly important to understand where the efforts are falling as far as effectiveness versus improvement, things of that
Yeah, it,
nature.
it seems like such a seemingly simple problem, but it's actually so profoundly difficult. And computer vision there. And I know you've done some really interesting work with the Great Elephant Census. Could you talk a little bit about how computer vision played a role in that particular
Uh,
challenge?
sure. With the Great Elephant Census, I think one of the big kind of takeaways was that we're not quite there with all the technology pieces, but in terms of the computer vision side of things, of course there is ambition to use both cameras mounted on planes, even things up to like satellite imagery. That's a little bit more contentious, I think, but the idea there is
Mhm.
instead of just having humans, professional humans that do this for a living that are very well trained, counting elephants from an airplane. Of course, you want to have some auditable, high resolution pictures or video, to be honest, and have that
Mhm.
be the baseline, right? The foundation for a lot of your counting or your census efforts. So, the connection there is pretty clear. It's pretty obvious. As far as real world deployment, a lot of challenges so far. And this is why I think it's interesting to have technologies like, with AI Reverie and others to try to move this forward cost wise and accuracy wise.
Yeah, so on that note, like maybe if you can talk a little bit about, because one of the things we're really interested in is data, right? And about like, one of the big bottlenecks in computer vision and machine learning in general is just having access to good, high quality data sets. The annotation process and the labeling process can be very difficult and expensive as well. But like, from your work, especially on the humanitarian side, like, what are some of those data challenges? What are the things that are, really create a bottleneck for you in terms of accelerating the kind of solutions you want to create?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in general, everyone understands the data problem as far as getting high quality images, especially for something that's more aerial, at altitude, you know,
Mm,
all the way up to maybe satellite data. For sure, that's the obvious one as far as, you know, very difficult to get, and if you can get it, also very expensive. There's also other elements too, to be honest, you know, just tied with, I'll just call it iteration velocity. When you're working in these environments, you know, whether it be Africa, conservation kind of areas with don't have all the right, or not the right, actually the most modern infrastructure capabilities. And also, you know, with airspace, things of that nature, very difficult to do that, right? You just can't be flying out whenever you feel like it.
right.
And so there's a lot of elements there that kind of just compound the problem in terms of even if you had the money and I guess some of the time, being able to obtain that training data, you know, at a reasonably rapid clip. So to get your build and your iteration velocity up is very, very difficult. In fact, I've actually not seen it done, you know, in any example, internal or externally. So that's one of those areas where the synthetic side of things, you know, can certainly help or augment, you know,
Mm.
just this mission, the mission pace.
Yeah, and do you have examples of certain edge cases? I mean, given that this problem is so important, what would you say that some of those edge cases represent? I mean, you talked a little bit about airspace not being able to fly over certain areas, but are there certain scenarios in the data set itself that are so important to sort of, let's say, counting elephants or thinking about things when it comes to poaching and illegal fishing, those kinds of problems, where you'd want the algorithm to really sort of have an understanding of how to handle that situation.
Yeah, so if you have even just an EO, kind of baseline, so never mind the thermal or near IR stuff, just the EO side of things, you know, it can get complicated just with regard to the various terrains. You know, you have everything
Mm,
from more savanna or let's call it more sparse type things versus jungle terrains, things of that nature. We try to select a little bit more, I guess, carefully there, and so it's not as daunting, but it's still a challenge around all the different geographies. And also, you know, when you have cover of any kind, tree cover, any type of you know, just inability or occlusion of some kind, it's going to be difficult to find all those particular you know, animals or elephants or whatever it is, right? And then of course on
mhm,
top of that, with if you look at something a little bit more sinister on the poaching side, you know, certainly there's effort to basically not be as obvious or not be as seen, especially for the EO things. And then, of you know, I think you know this pretty well. You know, if you look at even the camera gear, something as mundane as the camera gear or the video gear, you know, the lighting, that normalization, time of day. I had to talk about the long shadow effect as far as you know, it's sunset versus sunrise. There's just different elements with shadows and things of that nature, and so these things can all be simulated, but it can be very difficult, even with a traditional feed of annotated images, to just understand what you. I mean, even for a human to understand what they're looking at, just it's just daunting for such a simple problem, so to speak. You know, counting
right.
elephants in a picture.
Right. So certainly there could be benefit from better camera sensors, of course, things that can take
Yes.
images with more higher quality results there. But of course, yeah, there's always that balance, right, of what you can do there as well. So that's really interesting. So one thing when it comes to this particular problem of conservation, right, there's a question around what is good enough, right? So let's say you're implementing computer vision, and for certain scenarios where let's say take self-driving cars for example, where you really don't want a low accuracy there in detecting, let's say, a human, right? How at what point do you feel in the problem of conservation that an algorithm's performance is good enough, or do you have any insights there?
I can give some insights, but I would have to defer to, let's call it, both the experts and the decision makers here, just because, in my opinion, you do not have a proper functioning market to help you decide around what is good enough. You know, certainly for the
Mm,
self-driving cars analogy, there's very compelling market forces. I mean, mainly you know, usage and revenue. I mean, there's the legal side of, as well. I mean, that's not a joke. But on the conservation side, that normal or conventional market is lacking in the best case, I'd say. And
mm,
so it's difficult to say, you know, who decides, you know, what is good enough or what the thresholds are. Especially since, you know, to be honest, you know, with counting, whether it be, you know, conservation or communities or homelessness, it's not always in the best interest of certain stakeholders to have this data, especially if it's premature or not fully baked or you know, debatable, meaning that you might have a raw
mm,
data set, but various models may interpret things differently. I actually think that's better than having it on a piece of paper. You at least have a shot at auditing it or, you know, running different models through it. But that ability to come up with a census of any kind, even in for things like, I think homelessness is pretty non-polarizing as far as most people want it to get better. I don't know anyone that wants it to get worse. But even there, the ability to bring, in my opinion, incredibly cost-effective technology to the problem, not in everyone's best interest. And so you have other non-technical pushback there. And so, from a decision-making point of view, that adoption is not always a slam dunk. Even if the technology was like, to your point about thresholds, even if it was somehow technically or mathematically perfect, I don't think that's enough to solve the equation. Certainly in many areas, homelessness, conservation, I think it's a lot more difficult or complex than just the technology side.
That's actually really fascinating. I mean, Chris, could you talk a little bit more around? I mean, because this feels a lot more political at this point, right? There's like a aspect where the technology meets the politics of people's their own particular interests around what they want to see moving forward, right? So, is there? I mean, without hopefully it's not too controversial to talk about, but I think it'd be kind of curious to see how even you can create an amazing machine learning algorithm and it's perfect, and let's say you're able to count elephants perfectly, that data still has to be that, like, those results still has to be sort of contextualized and properly delivered in the right way for them to have the most efficacy. Would that Do you think that's true?
Yeah,
Or
I think that's spot on, and I think on top of that, I mean, you're a technologist. You've seen this happen, especially in the for-profit side, where the overextension of capabilities and even costs, right? Overextension in general, marketing, if you will, of these technologies, it can cause problems, especially as you start to develop and you're trying to get adopted. You're trying to prove that this is a legitimate course of action. If you get, I think, in my opinion, you get carried away with overextending those capabilities, what they can do, and then also, just making it sometimes trivializing it as far as just a purely technical problem. I think it's incredibly dangerous. Just in my limited time in conservation, that's been my big wake up call around. I love technology. I love working on this, but there's certainly another piece tied to the human side, the political side, as you call it, that needs to be addressed for adoption to take place, right? And so, and I don't think it's
absolutely.
too difficult to understand. I mean, it's hard to, if you're a stakeholder, there's very many, there's the countries, there's the park managers, there's certainly the conservationists up front, there's the communities, of course, a lot of different stakeholders. And there's us here, sitting in Seattle, trying to develop all this stuff. What do you think is the right course of action? And also interpreting the data as far as if there's really a problem here versus not,
Right.
or a matter of priorities, right? As far as spending on the right things versus possibly a deeper problem versus, why do people poach versus let's stop the poaching and, um, you
Of
know,
course.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
There could be sort of a socioeconomic context
Sure,
here
sure.
that we have to take into account for, right? When it comes to people's opportunity to find work and things like that. Because
That's right. That's
from
right.
what I've read, at least, poaching is a lot about the lucrative aspects of people who don't have money, who are living in poverty, and their ability to escape that by just being able to, take down an elephant. Um, so, yeah, I think there's a lot of, I'm going to ask another question that's a little bit also around this, which I've heard before, which is around, let's say you create this technology, how do you deal with, let's say, poachers themselves, right? If you were to sort of open source some of this stuff, and there's this sort of question about open sourcing an elephant counting, and I'm not sure if you've had to tackle this question as well. Like, how do you prevent
It,
it
it,
from getting into the wrong hands?
it
Yeah,
does come up. I think there might be some separation here possible, might be, around, like, let's say the source code. If you have an open source project, and people can see, development, the actual execution or the implementation via code. So that certainly can make you a little bit nervous because you can see how the systems work. But to be honest, with regard to the data itself, as far as especially the real time element, as far as the data itself, I would start with that first, as far as being the more, the bigger concern around real time. You can imagine if you were looking to poach and you had real time information on where some of the assets were or where some of the patrols were. Never mind the
right,
source code or anything like that. That in itself is a problem, and so I think we obviously have that, well under control. But on the open source side, as far as the code, the infrastructure, the execution side of things, yeah, it comes up. I don't think we've finalized a decision on anything like that. We try to be as open as possible with partners and implementation partners and all that, and so it's not full blown wide open GitHub repo. But there is something to be said about community development, and also from a sustainability point of view, as not just the source code, but being able to find others, especially closer to the front line in the community, that can truly understand, the actual code, if you will, the engineering
Hmm.
behind it, and then to make not just not just maintain, but also be able to extend a functionality. To me, that is a pretty grand vision around, instead
Hmm.
of giving things away, truly transferring the technology itself. I don't think we're anywhere near that at this point, but to me, that would be
Right.
directionally, in my opinion, that would be directionally correct as far as trying to get there. And then, having to worry about the security stuff for sure. I get that. Census stuff as well,
Yeah.
right? You do not, whether you look at census things for, again, homelessness to conservation to pandemics or infectious disease, you can understand there's serious sensitivities with all of that. I'm not so sure about the sensitivities behind the underlying source code, like a voting system, for example,
Hmm.
versus something tied to a census type thing. But the data itself, of course, if you add confidential data or data that should be confidential tied to a number of endangered species or pandemic related stats or homeless stats, you can imagine there's definitely well-intentioned, good people that don't want that being just open and public and just out for anyone to, to
Absolutely.
leverage or yeah,
I mean, one of the cruel ironies of this stuff is that the less there are of a certain species, the more expensive it becomes.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
can imagine that people can actually then leverage that as a way to sell things or, increase the poaching or motivate them more for that. Um, yeah, so that's fascinating because going more a little bit into those, one of the things you talked about just now is this sort of grand vision of transferring technology, right? And one of the things that you might be concerned about is we build it and then here you go, here, do what you can with it, but you don't, the local communities that need that technology don't have the infrastructure or the people to effectively use that, right? So and that is one of the things that actually I think more at a global scale with AI, there's this question about
Yes,
who are the people
yes.
who benefit from AI, right? Um, so yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Just like how do we sort of think about a way to create that transfer and to empower those communities so that they themselves can benefit from AI and they're just not the recipients, right?
We've had many talks in that area. I think it's still, again, in my opinion, my limited experience, that's still largely unsolved. Most of the structure that I see is around the, we'll develop most of it, and we'll get some help, I think, community wise. But the degree and the confidence behind how much that can transfer, meaning that the ultimate test being that the Vulcan, for example, just disappears, and the solution, in theory, if you
Mhm.
did things correctly, should survive and thrive, right? I don't think we're quite there yet. I mean, for a number of reasons. It's not just the technical infrastructure, technical capabilities at this point in time. There's other things tied to. I mean, just the money itself, right? As far as being able
Right.
to I mean,
Training
there's
that.
ways to recoup costs. Yeah, exactly. If the training data itself is extremely expensive and involves, let's say, satellites or something along those lines. I mean, currently expensive data. That just can be a challenge, even if you have the best folks, maintaining it, and the source code is fairly open and accessible. That can all be, still very challenging to maintain. And so, yeah, I don't know the answer as far as, what that'll look like once it's quote solved. But at the same time, I think directionally, it still seems like a very correct way to go as far as trying to involve as much frontline,
Yeah.
not just involvement, but understanding of the infrastructure, the execution bits, the operational pieces, right? And then also,
Yeah.
from a design point of view, we do this a little bit more with software because it's easier, well, easier relative to hardware. When you don't have heavy duty, expensive hardware pieces, I'm going to say this with a little bit of a hedge. I think it generally gets
Mhm.
easier. That's kind of my thesis right now. Is that we've had projects that involve very expensive proprietary hardware, not proprietary, but proprietary and just expensive. I mean, when you look at drones, military level drones, satellite type stuff. I mean, anything that involves these big physical, expensive to maintain and to purchase, that transferability becomes a little bit more questionable. As far as you can find fundraising, I guess, to cover it, but it's just more difficult. You're adding more complexity and cost to it. Whereas on the software side, part of the thinking is that yeah, there is no the marginal cost for expansion typically is much less, right? As far as just adding more cloud resources or whatever it is, and so I think that's a
Right.
reasonably valid way to go, from our strategy. And a lot of our new products or new ideas do have a much heavier software component versus a more of a hardware software mix.
Part of the game of being able to solve these problems really well is also just getting the right talent, right? And just bringing
Yeah.
people in and then so I'm curious in terms of how of course, there's the humanitarian aspect of it, but what are the kinds of people that you notice that, flock in terms of the machine learning and, those types of skills to your work? And what are ways that you want to sort of bring people in terms of trying to solve these problems?
That's a great question. To be honest, that's probably my number one biggest challenge. Like, just compared to everything else that I have to do as far as delivery side of things, like hiring and retaining top talent, it's huge, right?
Yeah.
And I think I don't know if I'd use the word flock, because it is difficult. As far as the mission over money, I think a lot of people will do the head nodding, and that sounds good. But at the end of the day, companies like ourselves, I think we pay reasonably well, but we cannot compete with a FANG company, whether it be equity or just outright total compensation. And so, you typically try to find folks, or you end up finding folks that have passion, that have heart. Maybe folks that have done well for themselves a little later career, and they're able to take some time off and work in this area full time. The other one is just new grads, if you will, that don't
Mhm.
aren't motivated strictly by, let's call it, total compensation, things of that nature. And the mission does have an oversized influence on where they want to work. And then the other one that it's already in play. Facebook, others do this already. It's kind of a hybrid approach where instead of having to make a black or white decision around stopping everything you're doing and basically having to come on board, a percent of time versus zero time of a very talented individual is certainly better, right? And so forcing someone to do a complete switch where you have to give up everything, drop everything, and then kind of sign up to join Vulcan or any one of these other nonprofits or for good enterprises. Instead of doing that, let's maybe sign up something where you can ask someone to donate 50% of their time, half their time, a percentage. It's not as potent as the full time, but I think it is. We have some good precedent for success in this area, and I think that model will continue to expand. And this involves everyone from engineering professionals to tenured professors, things of that nature. It's not just the engineers. I think there's others folks in academia, incredibly talented, but the tenure system there, it's a big deal, right? And so being able to
Right.
just basically find a middle ground there to get a percentage of that talent towards your mission, while they can still teach. I'll put teach in quotes, but basically they can still they can still bring money into their institutions over there. That's certainly something that I think is a good compromise, and it has been done, I think, reasonably successfully so far. So we just everything to me is fair game as far as opening it
Yeah.
up to the ability to bring, and
Right.
as it's never ending. It's not like I will figure this out and then we'll be done.
Right.
Hiring
Right.
and retaining top talent is job number one for me, easily, as far as
Yeah.
just keeping that treadmill going.
Absolutely, and I can definitely relate to that, being a founder of a startup,
Yeah,
that
for
it's really
sure.
about the talent, right? You kinda have to bring in the right people. I've also seen, having been an academic, I've seen how inspired people are and when they are working on humanitarian problems. So I definitely see how, really bright young grad students who are doing their PhD in computer
Yes,
science
yes.
can definitely be motivated to, take the time to solve those problems given the right setup in terms of the data or being able to talk to the right people such as yourself and things like that. So I definitely think there's a lot of possibility there that's really
There
exciting.
is. I mean, my favorite things with some of the smart postdocs, just folks out of school, their
Yeah,
capabilities, their capabilities to cynicism and baggage ratio is off scale. They haven't developed that cynicism or that baggage yet. So they're exceptional in that sense. I mean, experience does matter, of course, but for me, like
of
that
course.
ability to have that kind of energy without the baggage, without the cynicism, until it gets there, that's a great attribute to have.
Yeah. So, at Vulcan, there's a lot of humanitarian problems that your group works on. One question I always had in my mind is, personally for yourself, are there humanitarian challenges that you think machine learning, computer vision, that solutions need to have more of an involvement around, that people are not thinking about as much, that there is a lack of interest in those areas, and if so, what might they be? And if not, that's fine too. But I'm just curious if there are things that have creeped up in your mind that need more attention.
I think it's to me it's a good question, but I've actually flipped it around a bit in that I can't imagine any area. It's hard to find areas that would not benefit from this, and creating a Pareto or some kind of prioritization around what best is difficult because, like as you know, with limited resources, especially in ML, um, it can often be a lot more compelling to do this for profit, where literally there's a very clear connection between this level of
Mm,
talent, a very short time scale, and this is one thing we suffer from, or have a struggle with. Our time scales are typically much longer. Our metrics are definitely much more vague or undefined, and so there's a sure
mm.
thing, if you will, with regard to the for-profit side of things, especially with ML, and that to me is a much larger problem than Of course, it can help a lot of areas in the humanitarian domain. In fact, like I said, I can't think of something that it would not help.
Yeah, one of the things that actually was that allowed me to understand more about the problem of elephant conservation was the documentary on Netflix that Paul Allen funded.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm,
and it actually really opened my eyes, and it was quite powerful in showing how serious the problem was. And there's definitely, I think, things like that uh, can be very motivating for people as well. Just wanted to bring that up because that's how I got really interested in what Vulcan was doing and understanding that
yeah,
that was a
yeah,
thing that needed to be solved there. So um, that's great. So I want to talk a little bit more around some of the computer vision stuff, or a little bit more on
sure,
the technical side of things.
sure.
So are there developments in computer vision that you're looking at right now to sort of improve some of the work you're doing? Are there things there that you're excited about, or anything to talk around that?
There is something that I try to bring up. I don't know what it's formally referred to in academia. Well, one of my folks gave it an acronym STOD, STOD. I think it was spatial temporal object detection, and kind of this observation. And again, it's not us. We didn't invent this. It's not new, but this idea that we
Mhm.
do a lot of visual, the computer vision side, a lot of object detection, classification, and a lot of times they do boil down or based around images, right? Images, snapshots, pictures, when in fact a lot of times the source material has a time series as far as a video of some kind. And even the
Right,
annotators, if you look at the annotators, when they do annotate, even though they are annotating single images, they may be using something analogous to a jog shuttle around going back and forth in time, with regard to a particular video capture of something. And that is where some of the annotation becomes possible for a human that realizes that, hey, that's an owl. Even though from a single picture, there's no way you'd be able to tell that. But the way the head seems to be moving, you've gained insight into, to help you annotate these individual pictures that was encoded in
exactly.
the time series, right? And so I know there's academic literature on this, and I figure companies have probably gone a little bit farther on this, but it has not been as mainstream as I'd like. And I feel like
Mhm.
whether it be even the Nest guys, the folks that do porch thief cams, or doorbell cams, whatever that technology kind of bolus is, that's all for profit and stuff. But if there's advances on that side where you have a time series of images, a video of some kind, and are able to kind of share more of that goodness, those models, those learnings, I think that could go a long way for helping a lot of the other conservation oriented use cases, whether it be camera traps or census things, where it's not just camera pictures. There's definitely a time series, very indexed, very high resolution, and it just makes the model much stronger, right? Much more accurate.
Right.
For
Yeah.
these single images, and I think from a simulation point of view, you can see all kinds of potential there, not just with regard to these difficult things to synthesize or capture, but with occlusion. I mean, there's a whole bunch of areas where I think you could kind of
Absolutely.
you could almost brute force your way through that, right? And so that to me becomes, versus trying to collect that in nature. Oh my goodness, like and you could do it with enough money and time, but
Yeah.
to your, as you know so well, that being able to cleverly synthesize some of that, I think could go a very long way.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll speak a little bit to the synthetic data aspect of it. One of the beautiful things about synthetic data is that we actually have control as well, right? So even from this sort of ethical perspective, we kind of understand what we're collecting, and we can sort of we are forced to be held accountable to some degree by
Yes,
what we generate,
yes,
right? In that sense, and so there's power in that, and power in understanding the distribution of the data we're creating and the biases inherent in it, and then we sort of know what we're sort of putting into the algorithm a little bit better. I would say a lot better than when you're just collecting, tons of hours and hours of video footage, and then you're just sort of
yes.
wondering what's in there sometimes, right? So,
Two other
um,
things I wanted to quickly bring up with you, if I could. There was two.
yeah,
One was on the annotation side, which is basically using synthetic data, like a stream, to help. I'll just call it quality control, or audit, annotation centered. If you like you have a bazillion people, we have other ways to do this with statistical methods, right? But from an annotation point of view, as far as quality of annotation, whether it be a test or basically a spot check, whatever it is, there was kind of that element. And the other one, which is totally different, was if you look at the area of, I'll just call it sensor fusion, where you just have multiple sources. So it's not just an EO image of sorts, maybe an IR, near IR. That's already difficult to do, like period. That's just full stop difficult to do. But if there was a way to synthesize some of that, virtually to see what the
Yeah.
models, how they would react, I think that could be another interesting area as well. Because I've never seen that quite done. I mean, we've had theories about this, but as far as that, that ability to quickly fuse things and kind of prove that, yeah, this has legs versus, this doesn't help very much at all. Like it does not, it seems like it would help, but like the simulated images or the fusion doesn't seem to bear any fruit. And so you might be able to shortcut things versus going through the very painful process of doing this in the real world.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I found with just, especially in the world of humanitarian problems, is just um, because the data is so expensive, just some problems aren't even tackled, to the extent that they
Yes,
need to
yes,
be tackled, right? And that's a real shame because the promise, I think, well, personally, I think the real promise of AI and machine learning is to help like solve these global poverty problems. And it's to really make the world a better place at the end of the day. I mean, this is what we should be really focusing our efforts on, but just the data part is so expensive, right? And it really helps, really makes it harder to tackle some of these things. And to your point about sensor fusion, all of these things, the one thing I will say about synthetic data is that I believe in the scaling of that technology. I believe it's a lot easier to scale synthetic data than it is to scale humans in the loop
yes,
labeling
yes.
processes. And I think that's something that also needs to be considered when we're thinking about the future of computer vision there. So, but yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I think those are some really super interesting points. And given the sort of few minutes we have left, I just want to learn a little bit more about, in terms of given how important it is to get people involved in the humanitarian space, right? Like, is there something that you can tell potential researchers or potential people who are, sort of interested to bring them more in, to get them more involved? Is there something that you would recommend to them in terms of that process? People who are maybe young in that space and they're eager to figure out where they want to apply machine learning. What would you recommend to somebody who's sort of in their early career there?
Early career folks, I would just recommend, if possible, the ultimate would be some type of internship with one of these. There's so many worthy, top tier, super talented, super passionate organizations. Start with something like that, but that's not for everyone. There's a certain number of seats there, certain amount of time. I mean, the other side is just be engaged with what's out there. I think what's kind of nice, a nice trend that's emerging is this kind of the separation of concerns, where you don't have to have decades of formal training in a conservation domain to understand. Maybe there's a distillation or what's the word, decomposition of the problem space, and it's been distilled down into a object detection problem or a classification problem. That's very worthy as far as being able to engage resources and talent that might not be present in, let's just say, the conservation space, without having to have them ramp up and understand every single aspect of conservation. It can get dangerous if you take that to an extreme where you have totally disjoint resources that don't understand the larger context. But in general, I do feel, in general, I feel like the separation of concerns is a good thing, where it enables other people to ramp up and engage and provide value without having to understand all of it. I think I'm a good example of a lot of. There's no way I consider myself a career or professional conservation person. I don't have that background or training,
Right.
but certainly on the
Right.
technology side, I think I have quite a bit to bring in there with the correct guidance and management and structure, right? And so taking that to a younger person, I think there's also an interesting thing. You can continue to work on technology, but find an outlet or guidance, through some of that more advanced or proper conservation framework training, whatever it is, especially for ML and the ML stuff, the data science things, computer vision. That's just, I mean, the sky's the limit there. I just can't think of any limits around. That'll always be there.
Yeah.
In fact, if anything, it's actually quite lacking at this point as far as we borrow things from other areas and all that. So there's certainly no
Yeah.
shortage of use cases.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's such a hard problem. And we're
Yes,
still, I think, a
yes.
bit far from sort of solving computer vision in a way that is really meaningful. Well, when you get people, so you have lifetime humanitarian professionals who've just been working and thinking about the space. Do you find that there's any pushback from them? Do you find that they have any hesitation on adopting technology? Like,
Oh, for
what are some
sure.
of the, yeah,
I mean, no question, and I think a lot of it is justified. I don't know every single case, obviously, but certainly I alluded to earlier when you have technology solutions that are a little bit too much in a vacuum, and maybe on top of that have overextended their capabilities. Whether it be accuracy or robustness in a real world harsh condition. Whenever you have those types of things, especially with a technology company that's using this for more of that's a marketing kind of play, whether it be maybe a CSR program, it's very limited, right? Short term pilot, proof of concept, and it disappears after after whatever n years. There's no long term play. There's no integration play. There's no community play, and so I think there's a lot of situations like that. And on top of that, there's a cost element, right? Where maybe free for a few months, years, and then after that, whether it be cloud costs or software licensing costs or whatever it is, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and so there's a
mhm,
lot of I guess a lot of scars in that area, that I've been educated on around. Hey, you just can't be walking in here with your fancy technology solution, expect adoption, or even being insulting about, yeah, this is easy. Let's go solve this. The accounting problem's been solved. We're done here. All you got to do is blah 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 blah. And so that class of feedback, engagement, and also disruption, right? It can be demoralizing where you don't have a good understanding. I mean, I have to watch out for this all the time where you don't have a good understanding of the actual end-to-end problem, hypothesize a solution, and you market it as if it's the done deal. Like that's all you got to do. Here's the plan to fix things, permanently. So there's that level of humility. I mean, I think I've been trained and been fortunate enough to be trained by just professionals in this area, where you understand, you get to study a little bit of the past failures, whether they be technology tied to drones or technology tied to software, anything, hardware, software, and then just get a little bit more. I guess humble around listening a little bit more deeply and carefully before you start making claims around this could be solved
absolutely.
with this gadget or with this technology, right? And again, I think that's becoming certainly more normal these days. I don't think we're that wild west anymore. I don't think we are, but I know there's always a challenge when you have maybe new folks, maybe myself 5 6 years ago, where man, it should be easy to do, it's a solved problem in the military, whatever it is, and
Yeah.
certainly get enthusiastic about it, but have to temper it a bit with the history and the reality of adoption.
And I think that humility is really important, especially because these professionals have been spending their whole lives trying to understand this problem and trying to understand the nuances of it. But I can also imagine scenarios where a technology person comes in with a certain hubris and says, "Yes, we've done this to make a dent in this really really big problem." The media picks it up, and all of a sudden, like that
Yes,
media
yes,
then
yes,
influences how funding would happen for this, right? And then that can be
yeah.
detrimental to the cause itself, right? So there's things like that that I've seen in the past as well, that can be a problem. So I
That's
think
a
it's
that's
really
a that's
important.
a full spectrum problem. Certainly with funding, no joke, right? I mean, funding. I mean, it's the lifeblood for a lot of these projects, and some of the naughty things can get weaponized in the name of funding. And I understand the temptation, but that's where some of the technology black eye actually comes from. So just try to find a
Yeah,
balance there.
absolutely. So last thing, Chris, if they want to know more about how to get involved with Vulcan, what would you recommend in terms of anybody just wanting to help out in that space, especially your
They can certainly,
organization?
yeah, they can certainly reach out to me, and I can connect. I mean, if it's technology thing, I'm sure I can speak to it, or connect folks to some of my principles. But just in general, they can reach out to me via my direct email. I'm actually quite good with email, or just go to our webpage and dig around, and there's a bunch of
Hmm.
contact links, feedback links there, and we're out there, so it shouldn't be hard to find us. And then many other conservation groups as well.
Great. Well, Chris, thanks so much for your time. I think I certainly learned a lot, and I hope this was useful for the audience as well. So I really appreciate your time and all the work that you're doing at Vulcan. So thanks again for being on this chat.
Oh, thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun, and these are always great encounters. So thank you.
Awesome, great. So thanks for joining us for this conversation. If you're interested in getting to know what we're doing and for more information about future conversations, please email us at hello@aireverie.com. Thanks again.